Hi class, and welcome to the module on sampling. Sampling is a major part of the research that we do, and as your book notes, he puts it in this sequence of research that he presents in a very linear way, but it's actually very much involved in how we design the survey or the questions or our materials, and so it's really this back and forth process between our research questions, our materials, the measures, our procedures, sampling, and data analysis. So this is something that we'll be deciding as we move through the process of research. Your book talks a lot about generalizability, and this is something that I think we really hammer home. In teaching research and in teaching research methods, generalizability is a function of how well our sample represents our population. And generalizability of the sample is often our goal, but the priority of generalizability really depends on our questions and on the purpose of our research. So we may be asking a very specific question about the efficacy of an intervention, for example. And so we may, particularly in early pilot studies, want to get some kind of a signal as to whether or not our intervention looks like it's working, whether or not a particular curriculum looks like it's working. And while generalizability is certainly important, we don't want to have a sample that doesn't look at all like a population in which we would actually implement that intervention. We are not necessarily always looking to generalize to a full population of adolescents, for example, or of all gay and bisexual men in which we're trying to conduct an intervention that's a sexual risk reduction intervention, for example. So it's always important to think about what that population is that we're trying to generalize to. So is it all adolescents? Is it adolescents in small schools in Illinois? And then thinking a little bit about how to create a sample that best gets us some generalizability to that population. And so before we begin our research, and as we're in the planning stages of our research, it's always important to think about what the sampling element is, obviously. So are we looking at people, school districts, counties, college campuses? And is a sampling frame even accessible to us? Is there a list of all the members of a population available to you? If we're thinking, for example, of gay and bisexual men in New York City, which is what I've done a lot of my research with, the answer is no. There is not a list of all gay and bisexual men or all men who have sex with men in New York City. So you have to think about what that population is, and is that accessible to you? If I were going to say HIV positive men accessing publicly available services in New York, that sampling frame may be accessible to me. I'd have to think obviously about ethical issues around that, and if that's something that I could get a hold of, even if it exists. And then we have to think about what kinds of sampling techniques we should employ. So probability versus non-probability, and your book talks a little bit about the specifics around generalizability and our ability to generalize to populations using either of these sort of bigger types of sampling techniques. And then we'll talk about individual sampling techniques within probability and non-probability sampling techniques. So sampling elements, coming back to these terms. Sampling elements are the things that you're collecting data about. So typically these are individuals, not things, but people. And researchers can choose different sampling elements to address the same research questions. So we can use college campuses, college students. And we may be asking the same sort of a question about the efficacy of sexual assault reduction interventions, for example, and we can look at the implementation of different kinds of assault reduction programs, and we can look at the effects of those on individuals or the effects of those on college campuses. And so we have to think about whether the unit that we are sampling, the element that we are sampling, is people or is some other unit or element. So the example that I give here is, does sexuality education decrease unintended teen pregnancy? This is obviously a very broad research question. So that may be a sample of individuals, sexual behavior, knowledge about pregnancy prevention, pregnancy incidence. Or it may be a sample of school districts' number of pregnancies, condoms given out, pregnancy prevention knowledge within those schools. So we can think a little bit about how we want to break down the elements in our sample. And when we think about sampling frame accessibility, I mentioned some of the ethical and legal issues before, but this sampling frame is really this exhaustive list of all of the elements or all of the people, typically, in a population. And so this largely doesn't exist. So if we think about, for example, census data, your book mentions UK census data and the British Crime Survey, and that this doesn't accurately count the homeless people. If we think about birth certificates, we don't know if all live births takes place in hospitals. So if we were looking at hospital records, for example, telephone directories used to be the way that we did a lot of sort of telephone sampling. This is obviously not feasible really at all anymore with cell phones. And so probably not for individuals. We might get an exhaustive list of hospitals, counties, states, or sort of these larger elements, but typically not for individuals. And even if those exist, like for example, a list of HIV positive men in New York City who are receiving services via publicly funded HIV centers, service centers. We can't really get a hold of that kind of list. There are all sorts of HIPAA issues, so ethical and legal issues that would prevent us from actually getting our hands on that kind of a list. And so typically these sampling frames don't really exist for us. And so we often have to make a compromise between the desire for the sample to be generalizable to the target population and the practical reality of obtaining sampling frames. So this is this constant compromise that we're making in these situations. And so the goal of most sampling techniques is to ensure that our sample represents the population to the greatest extent possible. But again, this the sampling technique and our strategy always comes back to some practical concerns, particularly for graduate students, for you guys. You'll have very real and tangible concerns about time and cost, as well as the issues of accessibility of sampling frames that we already talked about. But for many of you, you don't want to spend forever in graduate school, and you don't have a lot of money to conduct the research that you're doing. And so time and cost are very significant practical constraints on your sampling techniques. So if you use a sampling technique, for example, that may take a very long time to actually play out and collect all of the people that you need or all of the elements that you need for your sample, that may not be a strategy that you want to use for dissertation research. Maybe down the line, but not necessarily for dissertation research. So in terms of sampling techniques, we typically break these down into probability versus non-probability sampling techniques. And your book does this breakdown and gives a few examples of each of these. And I'll do the same. I'll give a couple of additional examples that your book doesn't give, and then talk about some of the other ones. There are so many more. In probability sampling, all of the members of a population have some non-zero chance of being sampled. And typically these sampling techniques employ random selection. And these, as your book notes, are advantageous for research because they reduce sampling bias. And so again, this is the sort of way that we get typically get the most generalizable sample. And your book outlines a variety of strategies that we can use in simple random sampling. In simple random sampling, in addition to having some non-zero chance of being selected, each element of the population has an equal chance of being selected. And so we can do that in a variety of ways. We can generate a list of random numbers. Your book gives some strategies for that. There are great websites for random digit generators. We can do sort of a fishbowl or a grab sampling technique where we have a kind of a hat of all of the people in there, and we can grab and then choose that person. That tends to be a little bit less precise than using some sort of random digit generator. And then we have systematic random sampling, where we start with one random selection, and we may use a random digit generator, for example, to pull the number 16. I think that's the number your book gives you. And then choose every 16th person from there forward, so every nth person. And this can reduce bias caused by some systematic arrangement of the sampling frame. And so your book notes this, and I think it's an important thing to note that, as they say in gambling, chance shows no favorites. So your sample may be really well representative, really a good representative sample of your population, or it might not be. That's the thing about chance. So if your population is comprised of 10% people who identify as Asian or Pacific Islander, your simple random sample might have 5%, 10%, 50%, some other number of people who identify in that way. And so it's not simple random sampling, and probability sampling more broadly is not a guarantee that you will get a sample that exactly or even very closely approximates what the population looks like. In stratified random sampling, which we talked about systematic, so these are kind of similar wordings, but in stratified random sampling, we divide the population into various strata or subgroups, and then we randomly sample within these strata. And so those may be geographical areas, races or ethnicity, socioeconomic classes, anything that we sort of create a strata for. And this really accomplishes, one of two things. Typically, the thing that we're really looking at is trying to make the sample more representative of the population. The other thing that we can also do is use that as a way of trying to control for some of the demographic, in particular demographic factors that we think may be influencing our sample. So, for example, gender or race or ethnicity, to try and make sure that we get enough of those people in our sample to be able to examine the effect of that variable on whatever it is that we're looking at. In cluster sampling, and your book talks about cluster sampling and multi-stage cluster sampling, we identify clusters within a population. So the distinction between clusters and strata is that these clusters are typically sort of freestanding things, things that we don't necessarily define. So counties, nursing homes, factories, these groupings that already exist are not ones that we create, like race or ethnicity or socioeconomic status. These clusters are sort of a bit more tangible kinds of groupings of people. And then we randomly sample these clusters. And the major difference in this technique is often that the sampling element is the cluster, not the individual. This is not always true. Your book gives examples of when we do this multi-stage process wherein we randomly select clusters and then we randomly sample from within those clusters. So you may proceed to randomly sample people from within those randomly sampled clusters. And this is this multi-stage process that your book is talking about. So those are a few of the probability sampling techniques, and those are the ones that your book talks about primarily. There are other ways of going about that, but this gives you some sort of a general sense of the aim of probability sampling and a couple of ways in which we would go about probability sampling. Non-probability sampling, which honestly is the more commonly used technique, it's so often not possible to use a probability sampling technique. These narrowly defined populations that we're interested in may not have sampling frames or accessible sampling frames, and so random selection may be completely impossible or futile. And so we can think, for example, of a lot of the research that we do, and I gave this example earlier, how would we obtain a sampling frame of gays and lesbians or rural African American women? And so non-probability methods are often the way to go about collecting a sample of people who don't have a readily accessible sampling frame. And so convenience sampling is what we read about the most. It's the easiest, probably most often used method of sampling. And this is sampling of a group of individuals that are identifiable and accessible. So you'll hear a lot about convenience sampling for so much sex research that happens on college campuses. So there's a ton of sexuality research that happens with college students. We know a ton about their sexual lives. And part of the reason for this is because as college professors, we often don't have a ton of money to conduct our research. We often don't have a ton of time to conduct the research, especially because there's a lot of emphasis on getting publications out. And so these folks are easily accessible, easily identifiable to us, often almost sort of a captured population. We give them extra credit for participating. So college students are fairly easy for us. But obviously, this sampling technique can introduce bias. Self-identifying or most easily accessible respondents may not be representative of their larger group. They are likely not even representative of all college students necessarily. They may be slightly more representative of all four-year college students, but there are all sorts of four-year colleges, and different colleges are more or less likely to have faculty members who are actively conducting research. And so we are likely getting a lot of research from college students who attend larger universities, or Research One is what they're often called, universities, where faculty conduct a lot of research, versus smaller teaching colleges where faculty are often more focused on teaching than they are on research. And so even if we think about the research that's conducted on college students, those are often a very particular kind of college students. So obviously a lot of bias can be introduced. And often we have to think about how significant that bias is. So is the study still worth doing even with that kind of a limitation? And I'll say, often it is. We could talk a lot in our discussion sections in papers about the limitations of our sample, of our research more broadly. And so we can certainly caveat our research findings with this understanding that our sample is likely not generalizable to whatever population it is that we're thinking about, whether it's women or men or young women or young men or college women even or college men. And so we always want to say what we think the limitations of our particular sample are. And so a lot of people really frown on convenient sampling because it's not often considered not as capable of creating a generalizable sample of whatever population it is that we're interested in. And that is true, certainly, but a lot of research would not be possible if we relied entirely on probability-based methods. So often the research is worth doing. Research is constantly being produced, and one of the things that I think is really important is to consider all of the research collectively. And so even if research is based on a convenient sample, it still, I think, is capable of contributing to a conversation about whatever that larger topic is. And for many of you conducting dissertation research, it will be all that you have available to you. And so I still think that research is valuable and contributes something to our knowledge base. Your book talks a bit about quota sampling and establishing some quotas within typically demographic groups that we want to study. And so we recruit the sample to obtain some sort of a quota. So for example, if we were looking at really basic binary gender differences, we wanted to look across different levels of college enrollment, so first years, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, because we thought that perhaps for some reason some gender difference was more pronounced for younger students or older students, or we just wanted to make sure that we had a sample that was representative of the full range of students. Maybe one of the things that we know is that seniors are less likely to volunteer for research, and so we want to make sure that we have those represented in our sample. And as your book notes, there are a variety of pros and cons involved with quota sampling, so I won't spend a ton of time going over those. I think your book lays those out fairly nicely. Your book does talk about snowball sampling, which is a fairly commonly used method, particularly for some of the research that I have done on substance use. Those samples tend to be harder to identify people. You don't necessarily have an easily identifiable group of heroin users, for example. And so in snowball sampling, you can sometimes recruit some smaller group of participants, and you have to figure out how you're going to get that initial batch of participants, so what kind of sampling technique and recruitment method that you would use to get those people. And then once you enroll those people, you ask them to identify others they may know who are also part of the population. And we typically don't ask those people to we don't ask the existing participants to give us the names and contact information of those new people, but we will, for example, give them cards. So here's our information, give this information to several of your friends, and have them call us if they might be eligible and interested. Oftentimes researchers will incentivize this process. For a study that I just did a couple of years ago, we recruited the initial group of people using a time-space sampling technique, wherein we created a list of venues in New York City, so clubs and bars in New York City that we did some ethnographic research and found out were frequented by our target population of 18 to 25-year-olds. And we had different groups of people within there, but I'll spare you all the detail of that. And so we created this list of all of these places, and then we created a list of times in which recruitment at those places would be viable. So for example, if we had a bar that was on the list that we knew wouldn't be open until 11 p.m. or wouldn't be really sort of getting going until 11 p.m., we would have both that time and that space in that sampling frame. And then we created a list of venues that we would go and do recruitment at. And once we were at that venue, we would often do systematic recruitment within that venue. So every nth person who walked the door, we would approach them and ask them to do a short survey to find out if they were eligible for our study. And then if they were eligible for the study, we would try and get them to come in and do it. And then once they actually did the study, we would give them 3 cards, and we would put a code number on that card and ask them to hand those cards out to their friends who might be eligible and would come in and participate. And if somebody called in and said, I'm interested in this study, I have a card in front of me, we would say, what's the number on that card? And we would put that into our system, and if that person was eligible to participate and came in to participate, the original referring participant would get $20. So that original participant who came in, did the research, got paid to do that research, they could make an additional $60 by referring 3 people into the study. That was a very long explanation of incentivized snowball sampling, but hopefully that makes a little bit more sense and gives you a sense of sort of the levels of sampling that are often involved in getting individual people into the study. So again, this can be a good way to generate a sample of hard to identify or hard to reach people. Again, this can be very biased. So we recruited people out in bars and clubs and asked them to refer their friends. Likely we're getting a sample of young adults in New York City who are very socially active if they're out and about. One of the reasons we chose to do snowball sampling was so that we didn't recruit the entire sample out in bars and clubs. So hopefully people who go to bars and clubs have some other friends who don't go out as much, so that we could try to correct for that a little bit. But this can still lead to some bias, obviously. So there's so much more out there. It would be a very, very long lecture if I tried to tell you about all of the different kinds of sampling techniques. The bigger picture that you need to know are probability versus non-probability methods and some of the more commonly used methods or techniques within those. Time-space sampling I talked a little bit about, targeted sampling, respondent-driven sampling, which is similar to snowball sampling in some ways, and sometimes people combine sampling procedures. So I talked about using time-space sampling as well as snowball sampling. We also did some quota sampling within that study, and so that was a lot going on in terms of sampling techniques. And what I didn't get into a ton in this lecture, and what I'll talk a little bit about in this slide, is how to try and increase the response rate for people. So regardless of how we do sampling, not everyone that we ask to participate is going to agree to participate or even respond to our request. I have spent a lot of time, particularly in my graduate school days, when I actually had to go out to New York City bars and clubs and conduct a lot of that recruitment. I spent a lot of time being out in the cold on New York City streets at 3 a.m. Saying, "Hi, I'm from Hunter College. Would you like to take a quick survey?" And I've had people spit at me. I've had people vomit at my feet. Mostly you have people ignore you and pretend like you're not there, which is what I would do if that happened to me. So regardless of how you would try and go about this, not everyone's going to agree to participate or even respond to your request. And particularly in sex research, we know that people who agree to participate are different from those who refuse to participate or who don't respond. There's a variety of research indicating that the people who do participate in sexuality research tend to have more permissive sexual attitudes. They may have engage in more frequent sexual activity and may have more sexual partners. And so we're always trying to think about ways to correct for this in some ways. Being more active in recruitment strategies and actually approaching people to ask them to do research rather than having more passive strategies where, for example, if we were looking at people who go out to bars and clubs in New York City, we could have just put cards in the bathroom or put signs up outside. And that's a much more passive way of trying to get those people. And one of the ways in which we tried to correct for this non-response bias is actually going out and being active recruiters in that environment, because it's a little harder for people to say no when somebody actually approaches you. Not impossible, certainly. So the sort of recruitment strategy, in addition to the sampling technique, how you go about approaching people and how you go about recruiting people is actually really important. So one of the things that I do is think a lot about the graphics that you put on recruitment cards, the language that you use to try and get people into the study, trying to tell them about the research in a really simple way, trying making it seem attractive without being coercive, making sure that you try and incentivize it, again, without being too coercive. And so we talk about these larger sampling techniques as a research method, but there's this whole other side of the very practical end of actually doing the recruitment of people using whatever that sampling technique is that you're using. And so trying to make the research attractive, trying to get people to come in and participate when that may take a lot of time. You may not be offering any money or not much money in comparison to how much time you're asking people to spend with you. So these things, I think, are often neglected when we talk about sampling, but they are incredibly important in getting people into your study and trying to reduce non-response rates to your research requests. So a final word about some of these sampling techniques. The technique that you choose is certainly a function of practicality. Who or what do you have access to? Your methodology, what sampling technique will provide the sample best suited to your research. And your research question, again, should be at the heart of all of this. So what's the purpose of your research? What is your research question? What are you trying to do here? And then trying to balance practicality with methodology to best achieve those aims. And as I mentioned before, accountability is essential. So in presenting your research, present all aspects of your sampling technique, including your recruitment strategy, your very practical recruitment strategy. Include descriptive information about your sample. So what percentage of them are male, female, non-binary in some way? How old are they? What's their racial and ethnic background, socioeconomic status, etc., and be honest about your sample's limitations. The truth is no sample is perfect. No sample is going to give you perfect generalizability or representativeness of the population. And so be honest about that. We all know that's true. So I'll talk a tiny bit about sample size. I like the excerpt that your book has. I don't remember what page that's on, but your book has a little excerpt about sample size and about aiming towards some of the statistical analyses that we'll talk about in 851. And I think that section might be a little overwhelming for you, but I would like for you to check it out and read it. It's on page 182, and it's the distribution of sample means. This starts to give you a little bit of a peek into what we'll talk about in the beginning of 851. Don't worry so much about the numbers behind this quite yet. Try and really get at the concepts of these basic inferential statistics to try and get a sense of why we think about generalizability of a sample and how we think about sample versus a population. So we're typically drawing a sample because we want to study some phenomena in the population, and we use statistical analyses to make inferences about that population based on the data that we collect in our sample of that population. And so sample size has a major effect on how much variance we see. So larger sample sizes tend to have smaller variance. There are fewer people. And smaller sample sizes tend to have greater variance. And that may not make 100% sense right now. Don't worry so much about that at this point. The basic idea behind this is that we always want to make sure that we are statistically powered to find the effects that we're interested in. And so sometimes you'll hear about power analysis. Power is our ability to detect an effect that is true in the world. So we need to have enough people that we can see what it is that we're trying to find in that population. And so power analyses are a key component of sampling decisions. Your book starts to hint at that a little bit when it's talking about the kinds of analyses that we're running. And so we won't get into that right now. I'll get into that a little bit more in 851. We won't spend a ton of time on it, but I'll get into it a bit more in 851. The basic idea here is that we always want to make sure we have enough people to find what it is that we're looking at, that we're looking for in the world. I won't say anything more about that right now. In summary, one of the most important determinants of choosing a sampling technique is the selection of your population. So be specific about who you're interested in. So for example, are you interested only in people who engage in a behavior of interest? Or do you also want people who don't engage in that behavior? Do you only want people who are HIV positive, who engage in sexual risk behavior, who use substances? And then you have to be really specific about creating inclusion and exclusion criteria and defining those specific elements. So for example, if I were saying I'm interested in substance using young adults, I would need to determine what constitutes young. So do I mean 18 to 25? Do I mean 16-year-olds to 24-year-olds? Giving a sense of who falls in that range. And what do I mean by substance using? Do I mean people who ever report using any drug? Do I mean people who've reported substance use within the last year? What do I count as substance use? Am I interested in marijuana? Am I interested only in sort of harder drugs? A lot of the research that I've done assumes a certain level of normativity of marijuana use, and so we often have not collected data on marijuana, which is something that a lot of people find perplexing, and I sometimes do as well. So we have to think a lot about who is in the population that you're interested in, and that often goes back very much to the research question. I will probably give you at some point some practice comms questions, but one of the ones that we used this last year was asking people to talk about an intervention that was designed for young gay and bisexual men to reduce sexual risk behavior and prevent HIV transmission. And so what a lot of students actually neglected to talk about was that everybody in that sample should engage in some level of risk behavior. If you're testing an intervention designed to reduce sexual risk behavior, you want to make sure that your sample is comprised of men who engage in sexual risk behavior. Also, if it's an HIV prevention program, you want to make sure that all of the men in your intervention are HIV negative. And that is largely because of what that research question is and what you're trying to do with that intervention. And that intervention has obviously been designed for people who are negative, rather than being a secondary prevention sort of a program. And that also is methodologically what you want to do to be able to detect effects. So for example, if you're testing an intervention designed to reduce sexual risk behavior, and you have a bunch of people in your sample who don't report any sexual risk behavior, they can only get worse. And so at the minimum level, you won't detect any effects because they won't change at all. They'll stay engaged in zero risk. Or they could potentially get worse. And so you want to engage people to engage in sexual risk behavior, both because that's who your intervention is designed for, and also so that you're able to detect effects of that intervention. And so we often want to be really specific in creating our inclusion and exclusion criteria to be geared towards the materials that we have, the purpose of the research, and also to maximize our ability to detect effects of that intervention in particular, or to detect group differences, associations, whatever it is that we're looking for. And so sampling really needs to be a part of the planning process in our research. Again, your book presents it in that linear way and notes that it doesn't often happen exactly in that linear way. So sampling really needs to be a major component of your process. And unfortunately, there's no magical formula for sampling. Creativity and humility are critical when designing and reporting on a study, but there's no sort of magic formula or easy answer for exactly what to do. One of the things that I always encourage people to do, and that was something that was some very good advice given to me, is to always justify what you're doing. So you can design an entire study, and one person may say they're using convenience sampling. Another person may decide that they're using random sampling, and you really want to justify why that is, why that sampling technique is going to maximize some benefit to you and minimize some limitation. So it's never perfect. No study is ever perfect in its entirety. No sampling technique is ever perfect. But you really want to make sure that you're giving some rationale as to why you're choosing that. So if you have questions or thoughts, post those under the general discussion forum. And obviously we'll spend some time in our first day of class going over everything. But if you have questions before then, certainly let me know. All right, thanks.